Welcome to EPG Pathshala. In this module, we are going to look at sexual violence as part of the course on gender and social work. I am Dr. Shuli Kumar, Associate Professor, School of Social Work, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and I am going to take you through this module. The topics to be discussed in this module are understanding sexual violence, theories of sexual violence, context of sexual violence, understanding consent, which is a critical concept within sexual violence, skills of working with survivors of sexual violence, and a summary of the entire module. So we need to understand what is sexual violence and what is the ways in which feminists look at sexual violence. Sexual violence does not comprise only of sexual assault. That is how usually sexual violence is looked at, but it's not so just the only way to look at sexual violence, but it is also the kind of harassment, sexual harassment at workplace that women face, sexual violence in intimate and marital relationships, and also child sexual abuse. So it encompasses violence against sexual violence against women in all these shapes and forms. Conversations on and cases of sexual violence are often suppressed because of close proximity of the issue to the concept of honor. It is somewhere because sex seems to be a taboo topic in our society, especially Indian society. Any kind of sexual violence automatically has to be hidden, and it is also linked to the izzat or honor of the family. This in itself makes it very problematic for women to report or to say that they are facing difficulties as an ongoing situation of violence. This is more true in terms of child sexual abuse, where the child is not encouraged to talk about the kind of ways in which some adult male member may be perpetuating sexual violence against him or her, because it needs to be kept under wraps. Even if the child reports the same to maybe the mother or the father, she or he is enjoined to keep quiet and not to reveal it to general public. In this manner, the violence continues to perpetuate and to get problematized within the life of the child. So honor is a crucial concept while dealing with cases of sexual violence, and hence what is important, the interventionists have to eliminate the stigma attached to it, along with dealing with the impact on the mental and physical health of the survivor who has gone through sexual violence. The problem is that the moment sexual violence becomes part of the honor of the society, that sex in itself is a taboo topic. In itself, sex being a taboo topic, women and children are not informed that what is sexual relationships and what is violent and what is not violent in that particular relationship. So no information is shared. Second, whenever they want to talk about it, there's so much stigma and discrimination against sexual violence that the survivor may not want to report it and may not get the kind of support. So that leads to a lot of mental trauma and difficulty in the lives of women who may have experienced sexual violence in their life. So the enmeshing of the honor with sexual violence is a core which interventionists need to engage with and continuously support the woman to talk about it and come out of that trauma and work towards some kind of redress. There are several theories of sexual violence which I can take you through now. Commodification theory talks about the comparison of rape to theft, wherein sex is seen as a commodity that is stolen by the rapist. Kay Baker argues that the more objectification and commodification of sex makes it easier for younger people to talk about it. So, for example, while in the household, parental relationships do not allow any conversation on sexual activity or sexual relationships, there is a lot of available literature, films and electronic material which like pornography, which inform the young people in a very different way about sex, and largely they are violent, they are more male centric, and they tend to show women in a passive and violated stage, and that is essentialized by young people to say that this is sexual behavior and this needs to be done in this particular way. So sex then gets commodified, it is sold like that, even in the films, in the pornographic sites, and even in picture books and storybooks, in many different ways. So men, the whole idea is that men can easily buy sex. It's not a problem for men, and it is not a moralistic issue. It is their right, and there is no problem going to a sex worker or a prostitute. But even though state prohibits prostitution, but women cannot buy sex, or they cannot have sex beyond the marital relationship, which is something that is seen and understood within the Indian society. So she needs protection, she needs to be kept virgin, she needs to be kept intact and pure, and therefore she has no knowledge about sexual relationship or a sexual act. So on the one hand, there is commodification of sex, and sex is made to seen as a male privilege that they can buy. So once they understand that, so they would get motivated to go for various peep shows, or they can visit prostitutes, they can go to nightclubs, and they seem to be able to satisfy their desire for sex in a very easy manner, without having the complexity of the relationship, of the sexual intimate relationship that they can avoid. And of course the responsibility that goes with the sexual act is also not does not seem to be with the men. So the commodification theory essentially talks about that how sex becomes a commodity for men, not so much for women but largely for men, and it perpetuates this understanding that men can have sex anywhere, anytime, with anyone, at whatever point of time in their life. The second theory which talks about the reason for sexual violence is developmental theory. This has been used by many development theorists to say that men are prone to raping as a result of developmental events involving learning, and not by genetic variation or by any kind of commodification. Their analysis indicates that rapists come from very harsh backgrounds, and they belong to poor families, and they may have very dysfunctional interpersonal and short-term social relationships. They may also have backgrounds in which manipulation, coercion and violence are valid ways of conducting social relationship. This may be, these men may belong to any particular caste or class or any kind of region or religion, but the point is the household experiences have been violent, coercive, and they may have also faced difficulties or sexual violence in their own lives in the process of growing up in these situations. They may belong to a family which considers that having sex is normal with anyone and everybody. There is no value orientation. So when they come from these harsh and difficult circumstances, for them sexual violence is normalized. For them sexual violence is something that can be done without compunction, and something that enables them to exercise their sense of power and privilege. The other theory that usually discussed and perpetuated is that rape is like a gender-based hate crime. Now, this theory argues that rape is committed as a result of gender inequality and a way to disrespect and dishonor women. So, the women who are the honor of the community, they need to be kept in place by, sexual assault. In most cases of sexual assault of intimate partners, it has been observed that the acts have been premeditated. So, if a woman is argumentative, if she resists certain behaviors of a man, or if she is saying no to sex, a sexual relationship, or a particular kind of sexual act, rape is used as a form of coercion and control of the woman in that intimate relationship. So this is another possibility. On the other hand, sex outside, sexual assault outside towards somebody who is not really related, you will find that a lot of derogatory terminologies are used to kind of perpetuate violence against such women outside, while sexual assault is directed towards genital mutilation and also gross and horrific forms of physical violence to show the woman her place or to use power of the male power over women. That means that maybe the men hate women to be powerful or to be seen in public spaces or to be in the same space as men. So they need to be invisibilized, and therefore power is used to perpetuate this kind of sexual violence against women. Another theory is the control theory, which focuses on control issues rather than rape as a matter of sexuality. So the theory suggests moving from sex versus violence to a focus on control. That is that sex is not just, the sexual act is not so violent as sexual coercion is what is violent. For example, the whole notion that the woman agreed to that relationship or the sexual act, and that there was some kind of consent out there, is something that is propagated by the perpetrator of that particular violence. And the whole idea is to control the woman and to make sure that she is not able to move beyond a particular boundary of gendered behavior which she may be exercising. So rape is used as a mechanism to keep her in place. Therefore, the process is more of sexual coercion rather than violence per se, is what the control theory says. We may agree or we may not agree to this particular theory, but it does touch upon this whole notion of fear of rape. So using this as a process to say that if you go out at 11 o'clock at night in public spaces, there might be someone out there to rape you or inflict a sexual assault on you. So you curtail a woman's mobility or the girl child's mobility by saying that you need to take your brother with you, you need to go with your elder grandmother or somebody, you do not need to, you cannot go out alone because you're prone to sexual assault when you go out. So the fear of rape is more than actually the real act. It may not happen, but the control processes to keep the woman in her gendered space is also something that is violative of the woman's rights. That is what the control theory really talks about. Sexual violence has been used as a tool of war all over the world. Wherever there has been wars, there has been conflict, we find that women are used in different ways to propagate them as honor symbols of different communities. So across time, in fact it has been across time, whether you look at mythology, whether you look at real situations in different historic situations, most common strategies that are used during conflict and war is that of sexual assault of women to demotivate the opposing party, to demoralize the opposing party and the men in that opposing party, because the moment women are seen as honors, the men definitely get demoralized and demotivated, and they are then able to win the war using women as tools. And even in the medieval era, women's bodies have been violated, as it is seen to be the easiest way to defame and de-honor the community. So women are not seen as having agencies. They are just bodies or honors, socially constructed honor of the community. They don't have any right as human beings. And the sexual violence that is perpetuated in such sites is extremely barbarous and horrific, and women often do not even overcome. So whether it was in Japan, where women were used as tools of war during the Second World War, or in conflict zones at this point of time in Iraq or Syria, that we see that when conflict was happening between Bosnia and Serbia, women were constantly being sexually assaulted and violated to demotivate or demoralize or win wars. Another reason is the fundamental belief in patriarchy, the belief that men are protectors and women are vulnerable and so physically incapable of taking care of themselves. The perpetuation of patriarchy through wars is something that is critical for us to note. And therefore militarization and there is increase of militarization in the world. We find militarization creates more and more vulnerabilities of women to sexual violence and sexual assault. So they become tools of propagating that particular war that is happening in different contexts in different parts of the world. There are other contexts of sexual violence which we need to understand, that while it's easy to determine an act of sexual violence in the absence of consent, the issue more often than not becomes murky when the act is contextualized by a stranger. There may not be a consent in terms of sexual assault or sexual violence by a stranger. So child sexual abuse, if it is perpetuated by somebody unknown, then it is seen as because there was no consent, and therefore the power or the redress would be stronger. But if there is consent, then it is very difficult to actually redress it. And despite lack of consent, in most situations, the relationship between the survivor and the perpetrator determines the validity of violence. For example, that if upper caste men perpetuate sexual violence against Dalit women, it is seen the relationship is also linked to the caste hierarchy and the caste power dynamics that exist in that context of the urban areas or the rural areas, wherever the community is living in, to propagate the power of the upper caste community more than anything else. And so therefore sexual assault becomes a way of sending a message across to the lower caste people not to assert for their rights. Similarly, it's difficult for a sex worker who is selling sex as a vocation, as a job, who is in a relationship with a man for monetary benefits, to report sexual assault, no matter that the sex worker has been assaulted by this particular man not once but many times over. But she cannot report her sexual assault because the general propagation of the idea and the stereotype, oh, she is used to sex, so what's the big deal, So, but then she too faces that kind of violence, and it is very much apparent in researches on sex workers. Also, contradictory to popular belief, marriage is no guarantee to sexual intercourse and sexual violence. There is no guarantee that sexual violence will not happen in a marital relationship. Several mainstream cinema depict that any form of intimate relationship, especially marital, is equivalent to any form of sexual intercourse. It is interesting that Hindi films are very peculiarly locating women, that a man has to chase a woman and the man has to take no of the woman as an yes, and therefore and a man has to sexually violate a woman to ensure that the family honor of that particular family, the honor of that particular family is violated, and therefore the brother has to take vengeance against the perpetrators of that sexual assault. So how that gets propagated within a common context of people's life it's a very powerful way of pushing stereotypes and also essentializing and saying that it's okay, and even in marital rape, having sexual intercourse without consent of the woman seems to be normalized all the time. As a result of this, despite Justice Verma Committee's report in 2013, marital rape has not been criminalized in our country because it is seen as a private matter. It's seen it is seen as so-called consenting adult relationship and sexual relationship, and that in itself has become very problematic, and it needs further engagement by feminists on the ground. Defining consent that is free of violence is something that we need to keep in mind, and we can take this forward in our own lives and also in the lives of women who are survivors. So we say yes means yes, we are not talking of no. What consent should look like? At the level of informed consent between intimate partners, it's important to be in comfort zone with your partner, and to also ensure and question whether they don't have any kind of problems like STIs, that is sexually transmitted diseases, and many others. So have discussions, to know what are the health related issues and what are the preferences, sexual preferences that your partner may want to indulge in. Then there is another form of consent which we say enthusiastic consent, that both partners should want to perpetuate or participate in particular kind of sexual acts. You may want to watch pornography, but you may not want to watch pornography, but both partners should be able to say yes to it. And you may also want to withdraw after a point and say, no, this is not something I want to do, and re-evaluate. So as adult relationships, this is very critical to take on board as being consenting adults. The other thing that needs to be taken in terms of consent is it's not one time consent, it's a continuous consent. So in both cases, it may seem that it's okay to kiss, but I don't want to get into the sexual act at this point of time. So that's where you need to say that, okay, a no is a no, and it's fine even however close you may be as friends or as intimate partners. At points of time in each other's lives, it's every partner should be able to say no to particular acts and particular sexual behaviors. Consent without coercion. You and your partner's consent should not hinge on fear, discomfort, or even pressure. So you can't say that, oh, I will marry you, and you're in a extramarital relationship, and so you say, I will marry you, it's okay, don't worry, or I will tell everybody, or I'll show this film which I've taken to everybody. So then you coerce, and so consent has to be without coercion, critical element of sexual relationship. So we come to the skills of working with survivors of sexual violence, very important for feminist social workers. So some of the skills that we need to keep in mind is the case, in case of sexual violence, is do no harm. As a result of the stigma attached to sexual violence, it is important to keep in mind that the intervention should not have any negative impact, and special effort should be taken to minimize any kind of harm for the survivor. For instance, as seen above, victim blaming is common reaction in case of sexual assault. This is against feminist principles. The person who has been violated is not the person responsible for sexual assault. It is the assaulter or the perpetrator who is supposed to be held in dock. And if we as interventionists do the opposite, then we are not doing any justice to the victim. The interventionists working with survivors of sexual assault should avoid patronizing verbal and non-verbal communications. That is something that we need to guard against. Going back to the point of reflexivity and reflection, it's important to constantly cross-check and understand what kind of words, what kind of dialogues, what kind of language one is using when one is talking with the victim. So you can't say, okay, tell me what happened. You need to discuss and give me every detail. That's no way of talking. Or maybe, you needed to make sure that you were safe. Maybe you shouldn't have gone out at that point of time. These are some dialogues which are absolutely no-no when we are doing feminist social work with survivors of sexual assault. Confidentiality is and privacy of the survivor is the key to working with feminists, with the victims or survivors of sexual assault. It is the name, the records, everything should not be open to anyone aside from you and the person with whom you are working with. Age appropriate interview technique should be used. So if you are working with child survivors of sexual abuse, child-friendly methodologies and techniques should be used so that child feels comfortable and is able to explain what the child has gone through, and certain therapeutic measures should be used for helping the child to come out of that trauma. The interventionist must take utmost care in preventing re-traumatization. So if one has to remember, the sexual assault is horrific. It has had a long-lasting impact on the psyche of the person, and it is very difficult for the survivor to narrate each and every aspect of the assault. So it is not a prevention of probing questions, prevention of consistent questioning and discussion should be done, and other stakeholders in the process of this helping should be trained and skilled to do sensitive handling of such kind of cases. To avoid re-traumatization, it is also important that the interventionist documents the case of the assault very well. So, writing down everything post the interviews and discussions with the survivor is very, very important. It also helps in the legal process or legal action that can be taken against the perpetrator. So all documents need to be put together, and writing out everything in every minute detail is key to taking this the case of the survivor forward. As a result of societal perceptions and attitudes towards notion and of honor, sexual violence is a very difficult issue to address. The stigma attached to it and attributed to sexual violence, unfortunately, keep a lot of reporting hidden, and sometimes perpetuation of violence continues with the same person several times over. But it is important to keep in mind that the survivor is a human being and needs to live with dignity and self-esteem in the society, and has every right to do that. Rehabilitation offered by state to survivors of sexual assault is largely monetary, and that is very, very limited. And monetary does not take away her trauma, her life situations like education, livelihood, social support from not just a family but also from our friends, neighborhood, and many others. Although sexual assault in marital relationship is not considered as a crime in India, but interventionists need to address this within the notion and idea of domestic violence and sexual violence within marriage and family. Sexual violence within intimate partner relationship is many times taken for granted by women. Women themselves tend to think that it's okay, at least my relationship is fine, the person is fine, because they think that speaking about it would make them more vulnerable. There is a great deal of stigma attached to it, and hence often goes unreported. And this is another arena where feminist social work practitioners need to take it up and address it in newer ways and different ways to make sure that such women are supported to report such violence and take action against such violence. Some of the references that you may look at, of course, are looking at Catherine McKinnon's Rape on Coercion and Consent Towards a Feminist Theory of State. It's something that helps us. And of course, Kay Baker's Once a Rapist, Motivational Evidence and Relevance in Rape Law. And there are the various sections in the IPC which is available on the pages of the Home Department of our ministry. So you can look at that. And of course, various human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Commonwealth Human Rights Institute can give you more information on sexual violence against women. Thank you.